Welcome to this episode of the Joyful Scaling Podcast. Launching a podcast is easy, but launching a podcast that enables you to expand your reach with your ideal client, build your reputation as a trusted authority, and generate revenue for your business, well, that is not so easy. And so if you have a podcast or you're thinking about starting one, today's episode is for you because in studio, we are blessed to have a woman who is known as the podcasting queen. Meet Anne-Marie Cross. She is the founder of the Ambitious Entrepreneur Podcast Network and the Industry Thought Leader Academy. She's also an author, the author of Industry Thought Leader, How to Go from Invisible to Influential and Profitable with a Podcast. So we have an absolute expert on the subject here. Anne-Marie is an award-winning podcast host, and she's recognized as a pioneer in the podcasting space, having started her first co-hosted podcast back in 2008. Over the last 13 years, she's interviewed thousands of guests. She's won awards in both podcasting and personal branding. She's been listed among the top podcast lists for entrepreneurs and small business owners worldwide, with her podcast being syndicated on both national and international radio. I am overjoyed to welcome Anne-Marie to the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Judy. As you were reading that, I'm thinking, gosh, 2008 seems like such a long time ago. Podcasting is something when I found out, in fact, we didn't even call it podcasting back then. A colleague and I, we knew that we needed to be the voice and hope and inspiration back then. We were in the career industry and it was called, I think, online radio or something like that. But to think 13 years later, I would be not only podcasting, but teaching others is a blessing. So it's gone full circle.
Yes. And one big characteristic of you that I didn't mention is that you are a lover of the Lord Jesus. So we're all going to be, praising him as we talk through these nuggets of gold that I'm so thankful that you're willing to share with our listeners. So let's start here. What are some key indicators to tell our listeners that they may not be ready yet to launch a podcast?
Yeah, this is a great question. And often when people come to me and they say, look, Anne-Marie, we really would love to start a podcast. And I ask them, well, what are some of the reasons why? What are you hoping to achieve? And if their response is, well, we've been sharing our message, but we're just not generating the reach. We're just not standing out. Our message isn't being heard. And we've heard that a podcast will help us amplify our message. That normally rings alarm bells for me because yes, a podcast is going to amplify your message, yet if the message that you're using and you will share on your podcast is not already working when you're networking, when you're sharing content online, guess what? You are just going to amplify a message that confuses more people, and it's going to take you a lot longer to start to build that brand online, that reputation online that really will stand out to your ideal client. So be mindful that your message is already working, and then you can layer on top of that a robust podcast strategy to really nurture that as part of your business. Secondly, when people are unclear or uncertain as to where they want to position themselves as far as building a reputation as a trusted authority, and if you're not clear on that, it's going to come through in your message. And again, you're not really going to position yourself as someone as the go-to person in that particular area. And that's so much more important now, Judy, with so many more people online, people who may be offering similar service or similar expertise to you. And especially within the podcasting space, with so many people recognizing this is an incredible platform, you want to make sure that you have clarified what that is going to be for you, so that impacts everything from the name of your podcast through to the topics that you share, through to your intro, your outro. All of that is impacted by how you want to position yourself and how, of course, you're going to leverage it. And then thirdly, I call this not having an end in mind. And I'm borrowing Stephen Covey, who I believe said that. And your end in mind is recognizing that your podcast is a vehicle. It's a communications channel by which you can walk alongside and journey alongside your ideal client, building know, like, and trust as you're, nurturing that person from listener to lead. And if you're not sure on the end in mind, as far as, again, your message, your story, your unique offerings, where you want to take that ideal client, what's that next step, then again, often it's just going to, that person might listen to your podcast and then go, well, that was nice, and off they go. Those are some of the things that we made a mistake looking back over the years as to how could I have done things differently. So those would be the three things that I would recommend people focus on first. Not having clarity on that message, that it's not working, not being sure on where I want to position myself as that trusted authority. And thirdly, what's the end in mind? How are we going to leverage your podcast to be able to nurture those listeners into leads? What's the pathway? What's that customer journey?
Wow. I so appreciate that. And it all goes back to the power of the brand, because what you've just talked about, your messaging and who you are and the whole positioning aspect, it's really getting uber clear on what your brand is all about, and that those words matter, including what you call your podcast. That is so good. Okay. What are some 4 common things that most businesses become fixated on when they start their podcast, and why they shouldn't do that if they want that podcast to generate real ROI?
Yeah. And I think these ones will resonate when I mention them. And the first one is that people will often think that what will make a success of their podcast is the technology. Because often the first question that I'm asked, the first question I'm often asked is, where do I start? And the second question I'm often asked is, what technology, what microphone should I use? And this is where I'll go back to the first indicator that I mentioned, that if you're focusing more on the make and the model of the microphone that you're going to get, that is not going to automatically assume that your podcast is going to be a success. So focus again on your message. And I created many years ago a hashtag where it says message before microphone. And that is because you cannot edit and mix compelling content that nurtures and that builds know, like, and trust from content that, kind of I call fluff and banter. We often will compare a podcast to something that we may know, and that is mainstream radio, where a lot of the hosts, they get on and they chat. Look, this is a strategy for sure, but if you're using your podcast as a way to build a relationship with your ideal client, and your client is time poor, you want to make sure that the information that you're sharing is relevant, it's valuable, and is going to retain their attention right through from the opening moment through to the last sentence. So that is something that I would really recommend. Don't worry so much about the microphone yet if you haven't figured out your message. Of course, you want to have a microphone that doesn't have so much distortion in your audio, and that becomes a distraction. So that would be the first, what I call kind of mistruth. The second is publish the podcast and clients will come. This is something, by the way, I have done all of these and made all of the mistakes and then some. So I'm hoping that I can help people avoid this. And so what my co-host and I thought, and even in some of the podcasts that I did after we finished our show for 2 years, was that, if I just get on and I share as much information that's valuable as I can, then ideal clients will go, well, I liked what Anne-Marie had to say. I'm going to find out a little bit more about her. And you know what? That never often happens, because guess what? Life gets in the way. And so often I'm asked, Anne-Marie, we've spent a lot of money and time in launching our podcast. We have not really seen any returns yet. What are we missing? And so there are a number of factors that could be missing. And I know that we're going to talk about some of those in a moment. So don't just assume I'm going to get my podcast out there. I'm going to share it across as many channels as I can. And from there, I'm going to generate clients and leads. Often that is not the case, especially with so much noise and so many more podcasts on the space. Thirdly, this is one that we often hear too. I want to get in the new and noteworthy. Want to get listed there because that's going to generate success for my podcast. And this is where I remind people is be mindful that you do not focus on vanity numbers, because vanity numbers are often misleading. Now, whilst it may be nice to get millions of downloads or get in the new and noteworthy and the top this and top that, I've had colleagues that have had top rated podcasts that they have not been able to generate results from, because to get people from the podcast into their business and buying from them, there was a disconnect because the podcast itself, the show, the co-hosts, different businesses. And so, there can often be that disconnect. So I would say focus on building reputation equity first. Your reputation is bankable. If you're recommended, if people binge listen to your podcast, if they hang on every word, they start to stalk you across other platforms, that's the kind of thing that you want to create and the experience you want to create on your podcast. And then fourthly, just press record and start talking or asking questions. That's often what we do too, because again, we're comparing our podcast to mainstream radio, which is fair enough, I guess. But remember that your podcast and each episode is like having a conversation with your ideal client. So you need to understand typically, who is my ideal client? Where are their struggles and challenges? What next? Where am I going to take them to next? How am I going to guide that conversation so it's not overwhelming, but just enough information for them to get value, have some mini wins? And then when I have that call to action, I've created such a unique, compelling listener experience that my ideal client will take that step. So those are just four of the things that I'd often say. Just be mindful that you don't focus on the wrong things, but rather switch it. And how can you leverage that in the best possible way so that every single episode becomes a channel, if you will, that you can really spend time and speak into the life of your ideal client. I remember, Judy, one of my clients said to me, she was listening to an episode where she was at the gym and she was on the treadmill, and the conversation with my guest was so connected to what she'd gone through. She said, I just burst into tears and had to run to the toilet just to excuse myself. That's the kind of experience that you want to create. Not that you want all of your listeners to start crying or anything, but to be so compelling that, they feel like they're in the room with you, listening, and they can really sense that you understand them. So those are just four things that I'd like to share.
Wow. Anne-Marie, that is so good. And I'm taking notes. I have a page already. I will be the first to say, I don't know if this is good or bad, but I've always been low tech. Like I walk my talk of perfectly imperfect or imperfect action. I never got crazy about my tech. It's more about the quality of the show. But I really love what you're talking about, especially this last point on creating an experience that is so compelling that it moves them in a powerful way. And I'm going to be mindful of that, because I think some of the things that make a podcast more and more popular, and we 4x our listenership in 2021 over 2020. And I want to 5x that now this year and more. But I think that's the crux of it. And I think it's hard to define. And we're going to talk about the podcast positioning quadrant in just a moment. But I just wanted to kind of sit on that for a moment, that I think what really makes a podcast something that someone looks forward to listening to is, oh my gosh, I can't wait to hear what Judy or Anne-Marie or whoever it is has to say, because I love their perspective and they make me think and feel every time.
Yeah.
What is your reaction to that?
Yeah, that's so true. And, part of that listener experience, that unique listener experience, which is uncopyable, is you, the host. And in a moment, when we talk about the podcast quadrant, the positioning quadrant, the quadrant that we want to set in is trusted authority, so that it's not just a nice to listen to, but rather, and this is actually something that happened, because I will often have come up with a theory because it's things that I've observed. And then I'll go and ask my community, what do you reckon about this? And so I asked a question around, when you are listening to a podcast, people come for the topic, but they return for the host. And the reason I say that is because often I would have people come to me and they'd say, look, I listened to that episode. That was hilarious. Said, and what ended up happening was I listened to another episode, and by the time I listened to the second or third one, I'd subscribed and I binge listened to the entire series. And I'm thinking, gosh, that's like 30 something episodes that we've hung out with. They'll get sick and tired of me. When's your next episode, kind of thing? And so when I said that to, a couple of my people on community over on LinkedIn, they said, we never really thought about it, but it's true, because often I'll subscribe. This is a feedback that I got from one of my community members. Said I'll subscribe to a number of different podcasts, but if I've got 20 or so minutes to listen, I'll often scroll through and I'll go, oh, I like that host. I love the way that person engages and shares. I'm going to listen to that one. And so that was because of the host and the way they engaged, the way that they managed the conversation, the way that they wove in their style, their charisma, and that's important. And guess what? No one can copy that. But often we don't see the brilliance in ourselves, and we can either hide it or we don't bring it forward intentionally. And so anyway, so I jumped the gun, started sharing a little bit more about that.
No, that is so good. And I love that again, because it's us. And we women, if you're listening to the sound of my voice, it is time to stop the whole self-deprecation and the compare and despair. It is time to go all in on who God made you to be, and know that you are powerful and that you have a unique message, and you need to get that out there. And if you haven't yet discovered your message that, Anne-Marie talked about in the beginning, that's something that we need to sit with the Lord about and say, Lord, yes, I am a business coach, I am a health coach, whatever it is, but what's my unique thing? How do you see me, Lord? Because that's going to be so important. Once you wrap your head around that and get clarity around that, that's going to help in everything else that you do, including your podcast. All right. So now let's jump to the podcast positioning quadrant and what you need to have in place to position yourself as that trusted authority.
Yeah, absolutely. So imagine that you're staring in front of 4 boxes. So there's a square and then draw a cross in the middle. So you've got 4 boxes. On the left-hand side, draw an arrow that goes up. And on the bottom, draw an arrow that goes along the bottom. So on the arrow that goes up, you would draw, or you would write audience. And then on the arrow that's at the bottom of the 4 quadrants is authority. So audience and authority. Now, the first quadrant is the bottom left. And that is entertainer. Now, by the way, there's nothing wrong with any of these quadrants, but if you want to be a trusted authority and leverage your podcast to build your business, to build your reach and your reputation, then you want to make sure that you're in trusted authority. And I'll just pick up on a point there, Judy, about that imposter syndrome and having the confidence. And often people will say to me, yeah, but I don't know everything about my particular area of expertise. No, but you know a lot more than your ideal client does. And we're not saying that you're better than everyone else. You are better placed, because the experiences, the challenges, the journey that you have walked through are often the lessons that you now can teach others, because they're going through the same thing. So not that you're better than everyone else, you're just better placed to support that person. And I'm assuming a lot of that same person in other people. So don't let, kind of that, as you say, self-deprecation get in your way. The Lord has strengthened you through the trials and tribulations that you've gone through the lows of the lows and the highs of the highs. You're now putting that together in your story, your journey, the expertise that you share, so that you can walk alongside others and be that light for them, and share those lessons with them so that they can get to the top of the mountain far quicker. All right, so we've covered that. So entertainer, if you look at the quadrant, would have low audience and low authority. Low audience, I'm talking about that because people really are there just to be entertained. That particular person is, whether it's comedian or just bringing, any information, there's not sort of like that audience that I'm going to listen to that particular person because I'm going to learn X, Y, and Z. Not that at all. People are just listening to that, maybe in the background, because it's a bit of entertainment, and that person is not seen as any level of authority. So that's entertainer. If we go up a quadrant to the top left, that is more what I call the celebrity quadrant. And that is where you've got a higher level of audience. So, and also that person is not necessarily seen as an expert or an authority in anything, but they do have an audience that likes them. There's a level of charisma, or there's personality or something about them that is attractive, that resonates with an audience who typically will go back and listen, but you necessarily will not hire that person or invest in that person to help you with your taxes or your bookkeeping or whatever it might be, because you don't necessarily see them as that authority. So higher audience, but still low authority. The bottom right is expert. And this is where there is a level of authority there. And there may be where you might interview someone, or you might even have a show, a solo show, where you're talking about a specific area of your expertise. And because you've got a great heading, it's got SEO there, and people find that because they're Googling, and then all of a sudden up pops your podcast episode, they'll go and listen to that particular episode. But because you know who your ideal client is, and you are you are stepping into who God created you to be, and you're letting that shine through, that particular person, again, I said earlier, they come for the topic, but they'll return for the host because they love, there's something about you that intrigues them, that's compelling. So they'll go and listen to another one. And that takes you to the top of right quadrant of that trusted authority, where there is high audience and there's also high level of that authority. Your audience is more of your ideal client. There's, similar values that you have is similar to what they have. There's a similar need. There's a similar, kind of vision, and what you stand for, they resonate with. And that's the kind of thing that you want to create on your podcast, that listener experience, because you're then creating this community of like-minded people who resonate with your vision, your values, with what you stand for, the voice and the message that you continue to share. And that's when you continue to grow that audience and that community and building that know, like, and trust. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I've drawn my square,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
so that gives me some good things to think about, especially as it relates to the expert, but then up leveled to the trusted authority. So believe me, I'm going to be giving good thought to this before the Lord. Help me, God, to
and there's aspects of what you teach that if you have a look, and this is a kind of around the message, and sometimes it's not often obvious, but can be right there. And that's why I love kind of listening to someone's story and then being able to identify, well, this is quite unique, and how you're sharing that. Your journey is quite unique. No one can challenge you and say to you, well, you don't know that, if you are able to reflect and look back at all of the steps that you've taken and the challenges that you've overcome and develop teachings around that. I call these principles. Everything that I teach, I have certain principles that validate why that is so important. And if you can look at that through the lens of what your ideal client is struggling with, you look at it through the lens of some of the challenges that may now be having to be addressed within that particular industry. For instance, many of us as business owners now have a lot more, as we said, noise and competition. Not that there's no such thing as competition, because we're all unique and our ideal clients resonate with us. But you know what I mean? If we don't understand that, it's going to be difficult for us to bring that forward in our message. And so when we start looking and unpacking and going deeper and deeper into that, no one can challenge us, including ourselves. When who am I to speak about this? Because you've lived it, you've breathed it, and you've come, through the other end. We talk about the stories of Daniel and Moses and Joshua, their stories. I call them markers and milestones. We look at those and we read them. What are your markers and milestones? How's the Lord, brought you through those valleys? When we identify that, we use that as a lesson, people resonate with that. And that's why they'll go, when they're ready to make a choice, you're that choice versus just a choice of someone they want to work with.
Wow. I so appreciate, I just did a podcast interview with a branding expert. I think it's going to be coming out by the end of the month. But one of the things that you're touching on is what I'm really crazy about, which is you need to have your own language. And so I'm seeing you are masterful at this with the podcast positioning quadrant, with the markers and milestones. You have this as your IP. Yes. And this is what allows you to stand out. Even the name that you've become known as, the podcasting queen. So ladies, this may feel like kind of esoteric, subtle points, but when you reach a certain level in your business, this is exactly where, when you get clarity around these finer points, this is when your business takes off like
so
crazy.
True. And by the way, I did not call myself the podcasting queen. It took me years to, when someone mentioned that to me, I laughed out loud. So I thought, who do I think I am? Because that was many, many years ago. And then obviously that's grown on me. But what you're talking about is so true. And I love the principles. I'll often talk about principles, and then because they're bodies of knowledge and things that you teach, and it validates even further why these things are so important. And then I also talk about signature sayings or slogans, the hashtags, message before microphone. There are certain things that you say over and over again that strengthen what you teach, so that you put your own spin on things. And that's the kind of thing. I dream slogans. I do. I dream them. I think sometimes when I'm working with clients too, because these are the things, the elements that when you put on top of all of the things that you do will really stand out, because it embeds themselves in people's thinking. Oh, what did Anne-Marie say? Or what did Judy say about that? That's the kind of thing. And it allows you to just take what you're doing. I call those your thought leadership collateral. They're real collateral. They're assets that no one else really talks about, because they can't talk about it because it's your story, your journey.
That's right. That's right. And even these phrases, the podcast positioning quadrant, it allows someone, I picture someone, because I kind of did, I'm leaning in. I'm like, ooh, I can't wait to learn more. Or what I call one of my major aspects of my philosophy is, the belief triad. Yeah. And just those phrases, they're like, ooh, what is that? What is that? Yeah. Okay, really good. How about this? This is a topic that I know I struggled with. I mean, I changed the name of my podcast. And I'm landing here. Joyful scaling is what I'm about. Like, I've landed and I feel really great about that. But how do you pick the right quote unquote name, right? Yeah. So that you can position your podcast as a saleable asset?
Yes. This again was a mistake. A lot of what I teach now are happy accidents or mistakes that I made and kind of navigating through. Now, Ambitious Entrepreneur Show is one that I still have and I still love, but I got to a stage, this was a number of years ago, that I got bored with my own podcast and my message got lost in the noise of my own podcast too. And I thought, if I interview one more person that talks about hacking this and hacking that, because it felt real fake, kind of to me, because the things that they were talking about was not innovative at all. I'm thinking I heard that 3 years ago. So anyway, I thought I'm going to just stop the production of this podcast. And so I announced it on Facebook. And then it was over half a dozen people messaged me and said, look, sorry, we're here, you're shutting it down, but would you consider selling it? Now, number one, I was shocked that anyone would even consider wanting to buy that, let alone wanting to take that over. And it was a huge lesson for me that I had created something, again, that reputation equity. And it would have been something had I decided not to, because I'm now, of course, republishing it. But had I wanted to, I could have selected the best person, brought them on as a co-host, allowed them to take over more of the ownership of the direction and the leading of the podcast, and then eventually hand the reins over to them. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I called that my name, my personal brand name. Now, this may be your strategy to do that, and that's fine. But if you look at, and I've come up with this because I've interviewed so many business, consultants who help businesses sell their business. They always say, build your business as if you are selling it. So build your podcast as if you are selling that as part of an asset. Now, if you've got, a highly niched audience of ideal clients that are regular listeners that are engaging with you, you obviously want to build there's certain other things that you want to have in place as well. But that is a saleable asset for someone if they can come in and take that over. You would have seen, heard digital websites are being sold, so you can do that. But you need to think about the name, and this is something that I'll often talk about as well. So to come up with the right name, you need to identify a number of key things. Number one, what is your ideal client searching for? Are you able to come up with a name that taps in, like I'm talking about SEO, search engine optimization, that the keywords are going to be keywords that they search for? It has to be relevant too, doesn't it? Like, for instance, again, what was the name of your podcast?
It had been She Is Extraordinary before it became Joyful Scaling. Yeah.
Yes, but now Joyful Scaling. So there will be people's, how do I scale my business? And I'm sure as part of the introduction and part of the keywords and so forth that you have for your podcast, kind of the print stuff that you do online, and we'll have those kind of keywords that it will come up. And so if you can find that happy medium, and it doesn't have to be rocket science. My podcast, Ambitious Entrepreneur Show, the amount of people that type in ambitious entrepreneur or women in leadership, it's not rocket science, but people are often searching topics around women in leadership. So spend a little bit of time, and I would be mindful not to go, sometimes we go the opposite end and we are so creative in our titles that we think that is just incredible, but no one's going to find it because they're not searching for that particular topic. So just a couple of things to think about.
No, that's so good. SEO and the whole searchability of it is ginormous in the way of being found, because we could have great content, but if nobody's hearing it, it doesn't really matter. No. So that brings us to our last question. And this is worth the price of admission here. Okay. The one simple yet super powerful unknown tactic that's going to allow the podcast host and the whole show to nurture listeners into leads, even from the very first episode. What is that one unknown tactic?
Okay. So this is a tactic that, again, it was a happy accident. I started Women in Leadership podcast after what I call my worst business failure ever, which is, by the way, the best thing that ever happened to me, because it was that kick up the backside that I needed to go, right, I'm putting my big girl pants on, my business girl pants on. And it really was quite a shift. It was, definitely, I look back, the Lord's hand is often in those challenges, because if you trust him and you work through them, the character that you shape and all of that is getting you in the right direction. So after my worst business failure ever, I could not write. I could see that I was really burned out and I needed to take some time out to reset. But I also knew that I needed to still keep engaged. I still needed to do something. And I thought, well, I can't write. I can't put two words together or create content like I have been able to do. I'm burnt out, but I can still ask really good questions. So I thought, I'm going to go out and surround myself with incredible women who have gone through failure themselves, and I'm going to immerse myself into their teaching and their learnings through just the questions that I've asked them. And that's exactly what I did. But 3 episodes in for a podcast that I started, admittingly, as a selfish reason, to help me deal with my grief and loss. 3 episodes in on my website, I generated 2 4-figure clients by accident, really, for a podcast I started as a way to deal with that failure. And it wasn't until a number of years later that I thought, goodness, if I backtrack the steps of these 2 women who had no idea who I was, they Googled branding business consultant, came to my website, listened to the 3 episodes, and then thought, we want to work with Anne-Marie. What's the best program? And that's basically what they did. They rang me and began working with me. I thought, could I repeat that? And so that's exactly what I did. And that's now what I teach. But now what I do is, if you think that your podcast is, again, an opportunity where you're meeting someone, you want to then get them off the podcast and then into your community, onto your list, engaging with further content. If we look at the customer journey, I like to keep things as clear and simple as possible. So I like the 3 stages of the customer journey: awareness building, stage 1, consideration, stage 2, and then decision, stage 3. And so awareness building is all of the things that you do as part of your business to communicate your brand, one of those being a podcast episode. But then if someone is listening to that episode and you know that they're your ideal client and you know exactly what they're struggling with and some of the things that they're looking for, and not just all of the different things, but the most pressing challenge, the most pressing problem that enables you to then, at the call to action, get them off your podcast and then considering some of that content that you're then sharing, then that means that every call to action on the end of your podcast is going to speak to your ideal client and then encourage them to get onto your list. How do you do that? Well, you ensure, and if, by the way, if you've already started a podcast and you can't make this as your episode number 1 and 2 and 3, don't worry, you can create a beautiful little mini series and use that as your listener to lead opt-in, which is that tactic. So make the first 3 episodes where you're nurturing and you're spending time with your ideal client in those 3 episodes to support them with their most pressing problem and sharing what they don't yet know. And what you're doing along that is that journey that you're building with them is you're building know, like, and trust. You're giving them insights. You're giving them little mini wins. And so by the time you get to the stage of the decision, which, you've got emails and so forth with that 3-part podcast series, that really is your opt-in. They're more likely then to take action, to a strategy call or whatever it is that you kind of have mapped out. And that's what that tactic is. And I thought, well, if these 2 women listen to a podcast that I wasn't even sharing my expertise, but of course my expertise was there in the blog posts and in the content that I've written. And if you create that on a podcast and your series and then have that as your call to action at the end of every episode, then that means that every time your ideal client is listening, here's that call to action, they're more likely to get off the podcast and engaging with you on your list. Does that make sense? So that's what I now share with people, and it becomes your offer. And so, here's something else that I also did a bit of a study as well. I have determined, and this has also been, and I'd love your feedback on this too, people who consume content in an audio form pretty much like audio. So they're not going to read an ebook. They're not going to read, or even at this stage, watch a video series, because it's going to take up a little bit too much time. And they don't yet know, like, and trust you to the point where they're going to give you more time. So give them content in the way that they're consuming the content upon which you've given them that invitation. So if you're on a podcast episode and you're being interviewed on a podcast episode, give them content that they can consume in an audio format. And so that's why a podcast episode or a series, a 3-part series, can work really well for you. Wow. I mean, there's a whole teaching that I do around that, but that's just kind of in a nutshell.
Well, that's amazing. You have my mind spinning. I'm going to ask a couple of follow-up questions before we wrap up, if that's okay, because I just want to make sure that I fully understand. So here I am, episode 225, let's say we're about there. So if I were to say, okay, episodes 230 to 232, they're going to be my 3-part series. So could that content then be turned into a 3-part audio series that you put out there as an opt-in that you just kind of
absolutely. And you may not even share that. You've got two options. You can either keep that private, so you don't share that on your general podcast, but what you do is you start seeding and leading. And what I mean by that, you start sharing with people on the listeners on your podcast. By the way, I'm creating a special series, which is going to X, Y, and Z. So again, the most pressing problem, and you've created this. So again, this is part of your leadership collateral, thought leadership collateral. So start to seed and lead about that. And then you can then create the whole squeeze page and resource where people can get access to that via how, your team has set that up. So you don't necessarily need to have 4 or all of the full episodes on your podcast. You might share a little snippet on one of your episodes. Do it that way too. It becomes a whole new launch strategy to get people off your podcast and onto your list. Yeah.
That is ingenious. Oh my gosh. Okay. Well,
but imagine if that's the very first episode. Because how often do we listen to people? And again, I test everything with my community. And one of the people that I was sharing this with, she said, "You know what? You're absolutely right." She said, "I found someone who I loved and I binge listened to every episode." She said, "I went back to episode 0 because I talk about episode 0. She said, "The very first episode was this person interviewing other people. And I wanted to know more about her. There was nothing." And often that's what we do. We completely lose ourselves. That's why I often share my story. My message got lost in the noise of my own podcast. because, I use my podcast as a way to network because I'm an introvert. So you're not going to see me at conferences and things like that going up to people. But with my podcast, different story. But that is, so if you're just launching, let the first 3 episodes be that thought leadership series that you use, and you can open them, have them open publicly. I do share them on my podcast, but I also have them as a separate opt-in, because often what people will do is they go, I want to get the whole thing, because within that there's a workbook. I have transcriptions, there's some checklists and other things as well. So it's not just the podcast, the episodes, but it's also other things as well. And again, because I talk about your promise of value and promise of expectation. And if someone accesses this podcast series and it's got all of these, other goodies in it, people are thinking, oh my goodness, if that's what Judy is sharing for free, imagine what it's like to work with her. And of course, we can never give away all of our content for free and not have any other value. What's valuable is the experience that someone gets to work with you one-on-one or within a group setting. So wow them to the point where people are thinking, I cannot wait to work with that person. The expectation that when you finally are working with that trusted authority, the results that you're going to get are just going to be amplified and be far quicker as well. But yeah, Thought Leader podcast series.
Wow, Anne-Marie, this is just so much great information. Thank you so much for sharing all of this wisdom. As we wrap up, where is the best place for our listeners to find you online?
Yes. Well, I'm going to model what I have just shared. So if you would like to sign up for my 3-part, actually, I always break my own rules. You can make your rules and then you can break them again. That's what we do with entrepreneurs. So I've got a 3-part series, but I've also got a bonus. So a 4-part. Go to industry. Oh, actually, the best place is to go to the influencealliance.com/podcast series. So theinfluencealliance.com/podcast series. And then you get to experience what I've just talked about. But a lot of my, what's in that podcast series is helping people recognize some of the key things that they want to have in place to be able to position that brand, the positioning, the offerings as that trusted authority. And then the 4th episode speaks a little bit about what we just talked about today, about how we can leverage our podcast to amplify that message and be seen as that trusted authority and begin to nurture listeners into leads.
Beautiful. Wow. Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. And your go-to social platform is LinkedIn, right?
It is LinkedIn. So just Anne-Marie Cross on LinkedIn.
Okay. Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you for that. And any last minute, anything on your heart that you didn't yet share, I always like to give you an opportunity to, to kind of make sure we wrap it all up as you like.
Yeah. This is often what I share to people, but we can just put the absolute, what I think is so important on top. And that is that I believe that a podcast is a way that you can bring hope, possibility, bring the Lord. And even if you may not be speaking about the Lord on your podcast to others around the world, you just do not know where your voice ends up, whose life you can impact. So, if you are still hesitant about getting your message out there, that person who needs your support may be waiting for you to share that. So just allow the Lord to support you. And you don't need confidence. You just need courage to take that first next step. So that's what I encourage, to get your message out there, because someone somewhere around the world is waiting for you, just you, to share that message.
Beautiful. Amen. I second that 1,000%. Anne-Marie, thank you so much, sister. I know that the ladies are going to get just so much value from listening to this. I so appreciate you coming on.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity.
Sure. And ladies, thank you for listening. We want your feedback. Find me at Judy Weber Co. wherever you are. Find Anne-Marie. We would love to hear your feedback. Even better, make sure you subscribe and leave a rating and review if you haven't already done so. Thank you so much for listening, and we will see you again next time.